Welcome back, fellow explorers, for the ninth time ever. Welcome to Story Spelunking. I'm Sierra.
And I'm Stephanie. In honor of May the 4th, or National Star Wars Day, today we will be digging into the first Star Wars movie that would eventually be called Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope. Now, I must clarify that I am a huge Star Wars nerd, so I will try to contain myself a little bit in this episode because I can probably quote the original trilogy movies almost verbatim to you, which I will refrain from doing, at least try to. I don't know how old I was the first time I saw the movie, but Luke Skywalker was my favorite character. I have built my own lightsaber. Well, I paid at Disney World an exorbitant amount of money. But yes, I have my own lightsaber. I have a Darth Vader helmet. Like, I have a Bo-Katan helmet. That could go on and on. I have quite a large Star Wars collection. But in this episode, I will try to be somewhat objective in my analysis.
When I stumbled across Star Wars as a child, I did not know it was a big phenomenon. I was with my mom and brother Caleb at Walmart, and we fished A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back out of the big DVD bucket at Walmart, and our lives were forever altered from that day. However, the whole time I was watching this movie, I was remembering playing Lego Star Wars with my brother Caleb, specifically episode 1 because I loved being Queen Amidala, and then I would force him to do the pod racer part because it was too hard for me to do back in our living room in Georgia. And then when we moved to Alaska, we found the Wii disc of Lego Star Wars in the yard, and it was an absolute tragedy. I wanted to shout out my brother Caleb because by the time this episode comes out, he will have just gotten married. So congratulations to Caleb and Sophie.
Congratulations. As we did with the Fourth Wing episode, and we try to do kind of with each episode, is we try to provide a framework or like a set of kind of like an outline to keep us on track so we don't, yap forever. So with Fourth Wing, we kind of use the framework of whether something like art can be objectively good or bad. And with this episode on Star Wars, we want to explore it through the lens of the hero's journey, which is a narrative framework that's been used, I don't know, forever at this point. And then maybe by using this framework, we can kind of deduce what makes Star Wars so popular, or what made it so popular, or why is it so enduring? Because we're talking about this movie however many years later, over 40 years later. So we're going to use the framework of a hero's journey and go through the film and kind of try to understand, or at least maybe try to answer some of those questions.
Now, if you've never heard of the hero's journey in these terms, you would definitely have read or watched or listened to a story that followed this storytelling framework. The hero's journey is less of a linear, straightforward framework. It's more of a cycle. So when you see a chart of it, it's in a circle because it can repeat, characters can go back steps, but almost all major heroes that you can think of follow some form of the hero's journey, from Odysseus to Frodo to Harry Potter. Now, the hero's journey has these specific phases to it. Like I said, it's non-linear, so sometimes a hero may go forward and then go back, or may go in these steps out of order, but I'm just going to list the phases of the hero's journey to you real quick. That way you recognize them when we get to them in A New Hope itself. First, you have the ordinary world, where the hero starts in their normal life. Then you have a call to adventure. Then the hero refuses that call. Then the hero meets a mentor. Then the hero crosses a threshold of no return. Then the hero faces tests and meets allies and enemies. Then there's this phase called approaching the inmost cave, but we're going to call it the approach because it's getting deeper into the story. Then there is the ordeal, where the character goes through something major. Then there is the reward, where the hero gets some kind of reward, but we're not at the end yet. Then there is the road back, which is actually us going forward to the ending, but it's almost like the hero is facing a road back home. Then there is the resurrection, which is another term for this phase, could be the denouement. It's when this is like the peak of the story, where it seems like that we're at the point of no return, everything is lost for the hero, but they come back stronger than ever. That's the resurrection. Then our final phase of the hero's journey is the return with the elixir, which is the hero has what they needed. They have what they started this journey for. And now they're at a resting place, a place that feels earned. And the cycle could start over for the hero another time. But for this story, the cycle ends once the hero is returned to a feeling of home.
With Star Wars, we're not doing something that's totally new. Lucas is using themes and ideas that we're all familiar with. And that also kind of brings us into an interesting dilemma that you see not only in stories or books, but even I would argue in music. This is also an interesting dilemma. But how to be inspired by things that you've seen, heard, or read, but then not cross the line of plagiarism.
When you look into storytelling and writing and you read about them or you take classes, you learn that there's really no such thing as an original story. There's this like saying that's like all of the stories have already been told, but each individual artist brings a new perspective, an interesting element to the story that may not have been there before. I sent Stephanie this great video that's actually about the movie Rebel Moon by Zack Snyder, a soapbox for another day.
Yes.
I'm going to recommend the video at the end, but I'll put it up on the screen in YouTube. And if you're listening via audio, I will put it in the recommended further reading. The channel is The Closer Look. It's his video on Rebel Moon. He brings up a lot of the movies that George Lucas was inspired by when he was making Star Wars.
Yeah, and he introduced a quote from T.S. Eliot, paraphrased, made it kind of his own version of this idea. And T.S. Eliot wrote, "Immature poets imitate, mature poets steal. Bad poets deface what they take, and good poets make it into something better, or at least something different."
In an effort not to be a bad poet, I'm going to quickly go through some of the movies that The Closer Look mentions Lucas borrowing from. The first being Flash Gordon of 1936. The opening crawl and Bespin in The Empire Strikes Back were borrowed from it. The Searchers 1956 has a similar scene, or very similar scene, of
Yeah.
Luke returning to find his family murdered, and the main character
Mhm.
in that movie did as well. In 1958's The Hidden Fortress, there's a lot borrowed from that
Yes.
movie.
Yeah.
There are peasants that the droids represent. There's an old general and a princess in a hostile land. There's smugglers and smuggling. Lots of screen wipe transitions. Another movie that George Lucas borrowed from is Dam Busters from 1955. And there is dialogue lifted directly from that movie in the final scene where they're shooting at the Death Star.
Yes, and I think even other movies have been inspired by the sequences in Dam Busters, such as Top Gun Maverick, which kind of uses also like plays off of Star Wars. It's kind of funny, just like another version of the tunnel run, but with modern aircraft.
But what's so great about what George Lucas does is that George Lucas does it in the way of the good poets that T.S. Eliot mentioned. He's borrowing all of these things, but in a way that feels both respectful and adds something original to it.
Yes, and Lucas later mentioned that while he was working on Empire Strikes Back, or kind of in between episode 4 and episode 5, that he came across a book by Joseph Campbell called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and he was really inspired by the hero's journey that Campbell traces throughout all of history and how a lot of myths use the same storytelling frameworks.
I think that's what's so interesting about looking at this story through the lens of the hero's journey is that George Lucas was aware of the hero's journey while he was making these movies.
One of my favorite books that I read, I don't know how many years ago it was the first time I came across it. I checked it out from our local library in Michigan City, Indiana, and it's the book The World According to Star Wars by Cass R. Sunstein. He wrote in the introduction that Star Wars offers a modern version of a universal take on the hero's journey. And he further notes that the hero's journey has deep psychological resonance. It taps directly into the human psyche.
These myths are so intrinsic. Like I mentioned Odysseus. If you look back, even the Epic of Gilgamesh has elements of the hero's journey in it.
It's really a timeless storytelling because it's so effective.
These structures are tied into the way that we think as humans, the way that we even tell our history. We almost automatically fall into these sort of storytelling tropes because of the way we live our lives.
And then as we kind of transition to the film itself, it's always interesting to kind of dive into the behind the scenes. We'll very briefly talk about it, but to understand the movie of Star Wars, you need to understand when it came out. George Lucas was relatively an unknown figure. His only major film that came out before Star Wars was American Graffiti. After he finished that movie, he really wanted to change gears and kind of tell a classic fairy tale in this. It's kind of like a space opera in some ways too.
It is
And
exactly a space opera.
it's important to know too, the 1970s, like sci-fi movies were not super popular, and a lot of studios, so many studios turned Lucas down. They didn't want to even attempt this film, but eventually he got 20th Century Fox agreed to finance it. And then you know me, we cannot talk about Star Wars without John Williams. It's interesting, in an interview, Lucas said that while he was writing the script for Star Wars, he listened to the works of classical composers such as Richard Wagner, Gustav Holst, Richard Strauss, and then like movie soundtracks by Eric Korngold, Max Steiner, and a couple others. And so when he was coming up with the idea of who would write the score for the movie, he wanted something that invoked that same type of sound, grand classical scoring that you see in Wagner's operas and stuff like that. So it actually was Steven Spielberg who had just worked with Williams on a movie you probably have heard of, Jaws, which came out in 1975. It was Spielberg who recommended John Williams to Lucas.
I think that makes a lot of sense, the classical composers that you mentioned. I actually played Holst's Jupiter and the Imperial March at a piano recital one time. And I think you can definitely see the influence of the planets on
Yes.
the score of this movie. I've never noticed that before, but that makes total sense.
It deals with the same issue when we were talking about inspiration versus plagiarism, because there are pieces of whole planets that sound really, really similar to Star Wars, or pieces from Eric Korngold's scores for the movie like The Seahawk that sound really similar to parts of Star Wars. But again, I think it's clear enough that it's original enough that this we can credit Williams and give him all the credit he is due. I will forever defend John Williams against those who claim he just plagiarized.
I can't remember if you said this to me or quoted this to me or I read this in Brian J. Jones, George Lucas, A Life, but it's about capturing the feeling, not necessarily copying directly. That might have even
Exactly.
been in the YouTube video that I mentioned previously, the closer look video. First of all, kind of crazy that we just play music and we're like, that music represents space to me. And you capture a feeling like that in
Yeah.
just sound. The feeling is there, even if it's not a direct copy. They carried a vibe.
Mhm.
They've transferred the vibe.
Exactly, because Williams said in an interview that right after he met with Lucas, actually, they first met each other in April of 1975. And Williams said, I thought the film would give me the opportunity to write an old-fashioned, swashbuckling symphonic score. So that's what I did.
That kind of calls us back to the vibe of Indiana Jones as well. These movies Lucas was making were very much a callback to an earlier era.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it was also a really good idea to use like the space setting, but would score it with traditional music. And I think that really does actually help Star Wars succeed. Lucas later gave a lot of credit to Williams, saying that his movies wouldn't be half of what they were if it wasn't for Williams' score. I'm going to read a somewhat lengthy quote by Williams, but I think it encapsulates another reason why using traditional music in a somewhat unfamiliar environment really makes the music stand out and helps drive the story. Williams explained, the films themselves showed us characters we hadn't seen before and planets unimagined and so on. But the music was emotionally familiar. Music that would put us in touch with very familiar and remembered emotions, which for me as a musician translated into the use of 19th century operatic idioms. These sorts of influences would put us in touch with remembered theatrical experiences, as well all Western experiences, to be sure.
It's kind of like how we were trying to determine who decides what's a classic in our last episode on Fourth Wing. Music that was only available to the rich, the powerful, the nobility in an older era, opera would come down to be the influences of what's the entertainment of the masses in Star Wars.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point because I've never thought about it that way. Opera still to this day is pretty inaccessible for the average person, I would argue.
It's pretty highfalutin.
But sorry, my score corner got a little bit large there and turned into a room. But we will return to looking at the film itself through the lens of the hero's journey. And like Sierra mentioned, we have the first step, which is the ordinary world.
In A New Hope, the ordinary world is not actually the first thing we see. Stephanie pointed this out to me earlier. We start with the droids. And this poses the argument, is R2D2 actually the main character of these movies? That may be an argument for another day, but a point I would be remiss if I did not bring up. Then, after we're done with the droids, for actually multiple scenes with the droids, again adding to the argument that R2D2 may be the main character, we get to Luke on his family's moisture farm on Tatooine. And what these scenes do is establish, in not very long at all, Luke's day-to-day life, his normal life in the ordinary world. This is what he is leaving to go on his hero's journey, and we need to understand that to know how important this journey is. We get back to the true main characters of the entire Star Wars saga, C-3PO and R2-D2.
I do love the banter between them, and it's such interesting because even though we can't really understand what R2D2 is saying, we understand what he's saying based on, C-3PO's he treats R2D2 very poorly, I will say.
Well, R2-D2 is functionally, aside from being the main character, a sassy trash can.
A C-3PO tells him, "Don't call me a mindless philosopher, you overweight glob of grease."
We were also kind of discussing C-3PO's accent and how he's very posh. I think we kind of both came to the conclusion that his posh accent both juxtaposes with his beat up exterior, but also makes sense for his function as basically an etiquette robot.
When they get into the escape pod, C-3PO asks R2-D2, "Are you sure this thing is safe?" And I'm like, it's an escape pod, so yes.
I would never go into space, unlike those girl bosses who just went up with Blue Origin. I would also be remiss not to mention that because it's all I've been thinking about. That just
Apparently they
happened.
solved all issues by going to space.
See, I would never do that. I'm never going to space. I'm never teleporting. I'm never time traveling. Just so you all know for posterity's sake. I just listened to a book on the Titanic called A Night to Remember for the 113th anniversary of the Titanic's sinking. And based on how those people felt about the lifeboats, I understand not being sure about an escape pod.
Once they land on Tatooine, the banter does not stop, and then they argue which way to go. And C-3PO says, "Fine, go that way. You'll be malfunctioning within a day, you nearsighted scrap pile."
And they are scrap pilish. That's how Luke finds them because they are being sold as junk droids, basically. And they need help around the moisture farm, which I will never get over the existence of. So Luke and his uncle go and pick up these droids.
Yeah, his uncle tells him, "You can waste time when your chores are done."
His ordinary world is very petulant teen. The man whose name I should have learned, and I apologize for not doing so before we started this video, of the closer look, brings up that Luke's struggles are very relatable in this establishing ordinary world section. He longs to go on adventures. He wants to be a pilot. However, he has this responsibility and his family back home, and he doesn't want to abandon them to farm moisture themselves. They need an able-bodied young man to stay and help, and that's been a struggle for all of history. He wants adventure, but he loves and needs to help his family.
Yeah, and then his ordinary world is rocked by, while he's trying to clean R2-D2, he comes across the famous message, "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope."
I will have much more to say about Princess Leia and Carrie Fisher later, don't you worry. However, even from the opening moments when she's in the scenes with the main characters, the droids, and when she appears as a hologram, she is so iconic. I went as her for Halloween, twice as a child and once as an adult.
And
Brunette-headed girls hero
yeah,
everywhere.
and she has her own theme, which is absolutely beautiful. Initially, it is introduced with the oboe.
We had another score that was oboe. It was in Little Women.
Yes, yep,
Shout out
the
to the
oboe.
oboist.
It is the solo instrument of the orchestra.
Now, once Luke has this message from the droid, I would argue that this message is his call to adventure because he recognizes the name Kenobi as being the name of a crazy old man in his area. And who has lived in a rural community and not had some sort of locally recognizable crazy old man? So Luke goes off in search of Ben Kenobi, chasing after the droids who have tricked him because they are the main characters into letting them escape. So he leaves the farm on the prelude to a grand adventure, but an adventure of itself. We start the call to adventure seeking out Ben Kenobi. Once there, Ben, who is Obi-Wan Kenobi, tells Luke about his father and how they need to go help the rebellion and come with me, Luke. This is the call. This is the true call to the grander adventure, outside of just chasing droids through the desert and fighting off sand people. But Luke, keeping in mind his ordinary world's problems, says he can't go, he needs to stay and help his family. This is his refusal of the call. He needs to help his family on the farm. He can't go off saving princesses, even though he really, really wants to. And disgustingly, as we will learn later, thinks she's beautiful and is attracted to her. That's his sister. I don't think that's really a spoiler alert. This came out in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, if you haven't seen this movie by now, I'm sorry. There's no excuse.
George Lucas would later claim that it was his plan from the beginning to have them as siblings. However, many other sources would claim that was not the case.
Yeah, I hope it wasn't the case, actually.
So he refuses the call.
And then the next phase in the meeting the mentor. So this is where we talk about like the flexibility. He meets Obi-Wan before his refusal to the call. It's the famous hello there. I always cracks me up that Obi-Wan is really embracing the, crazy old wizard vibe. And no offense to Alec Guinness, and I don't know what happened to Ewan McGregor that he turned into Alec Guinness.
It's so crazy when you keep in mind. Obviously, we know that the original trilogy was filmed well before the prequels were probably even thought of. But all I could think was there must be no lotion in this desert. Mr. Kenobi has not been doing his skincare. We already know that moisture is in short supply because Luke lives on a moisture farm. The desert was not kind to Obi-Wan.
No, it
He
was not.
aged like a raisin. So we have reversed our refusing the call and meeting the mentor. We get to the phase in the circle. If you can imagine the hero's journey circle in your mind or look at it in the YouTube video, we get to this phase called crossing the threshold. This is basically the point of no return. On the journey, there's no going back after this point. You have a mentor, you've gotten a call, you've refused to call, and now there's no more. There's choice, but your choices are more limited if you have them. The threshold is crossed. Luke returns to the farm to find that his aunt and uncle are dead.
Yeah, and the score does a really good job building the anticipation when he jumps on his like speeder bike thingy and then, comes up on the farm and you see it's burning. I must have just missed it as a kid, but I did not realize actually quite how gruesome the death of his aunt and uncle are. Like you see their bodies.
I remember watching as a kid for the first time that I noticed their bodies because I'd probably watched countless times before I was like, wait a second, that's a smoking corpse.
Yeah, I had the same experience. I saw it I don't know how many times before I noticed that those are their actual bodies.
It's actually very gruesome, but I think it does represent that we have crossed the threshold.
Mhm.
Crossing the threshold, it's crossed. And then we go further because Luke can't stay here anymore. It's not an
Mhm.
option. The moisture has dried up, the farm is gone, and his family is desiccated. Another thing I noticed on this watch is for some reason I always thought, well, that's because the sand people did it. I don't know why it took me to my big age to realize that obviously the Empire is the one that killed them and not the
Mhm.
sand people. I'm so sorry, sand people. I've been slandering you. I was like Anakin. I was like, kill them all, the women and the children. Just kidding. But that's kind of how I felt because I was like, it was so messed up for them to go back to his farm when they never done that before. They didn't do that. That was the Empire.
Yeah, and I think it's another example of show don't tell because we know like instinctively because of the way the empire is presented like in its clear homage to Germany in the 1930s and 40s, but we haven't really seen them necessarily do that much because yes, they capture the princess, that those are typical. You could see that as just, war. But then they go and kill his family just because they may have had the droids because the droids aren't there. And so now you see how cruel and evil the Empire is without being told really that they are.
That is such a good point. Lucas trusted his audience enough and used enough real world symbols and images that you picked up on who the Empire was without them they didn't have to go on this long explanation. The symbolism was enough that you saw it in a frame, you saw it in an image, and you understood what was going on.
Yeah, so I think the world building in Star Wars is really interesting because it's intuitive. You don't need it explained to you, which I think is an interesting way to avoid some of the exposition dumping that has to happen in some other fantasy worlds or sci-fi worlds.
They trusted the audience.
So the next stop in our hero's journey is the phase test, allies, and enemies.
Nothing exemplifies this scene like the ever iconic cantina scene.
And then once we get into the town, we go into the bar, the racist bar, may I add, because they don't serve their kind here. We're referring to the droids.
So they've
And
kicked the
we
main characters out.
yes. And you hear probably, I keep saying the most iconic, but I think it's not a hyperbole at this point. The most iconic diegetic music ever. The Cantina band's playing it because it's diegetic because the characters on screen are also hearing it.
I think it's very fair to say one of the most iconic pieces of film scoring, even ever. That's when you recognize anytime you hear it.
I also think it's just so funny that, after they have Obi-Wan and Luke have their altercation and Obi-Wan, cuts the guy's arm off, the music stops for just like a few seconds and then they start playing again. And it's like, oh, just a normal Thursday here.
And then we are introduced to, I'll try not to go on too long about this because I already yapped unceasingly about this in the Indiana Jones episode. But suddenly, Harrison Ford is here. And as
Yes.
much as I said about the 1940s styling of Indiana Jones, this time I thought, you know what? Han Solo is a better look. This is a good look for Harrison Ford.
The roguish smuggler who's kind of a morally gray character because I do think he shot first. I don't care what the later edits show.
We could get into the editing of this movie forever.
There's interesting differences, scenes added, and unfortunately, some of the things that were added later on kind of really stick out because the CGI it's a really jarring juxtaposition between the 1970s and I guess the early 2000s.
There's this amazing claymation quality to a lot of the monsters and creatures and aliens in the earlier edits. Again, a soapbox for another day. Jim Henson's Creature Shop helped make a lot of the puppets for especially the later movies. And you guys know, if you listen to our John Williams episode, I believe, I love Jim Henson. There's just something so charming about
Mhm.
the non-CGI parts that when you see these CGI things, like CGI Jabba the Hutt, you're like, why is this so weirdly clean
Yeah.
and gooey moving?
I also think it ruins the reveal of Jabba the Hutt in Return of the Jedi.
Also, why is Jabba the Hutt, a very slimy looking creature, living on Tatooine, which is very dry? It feels like he would turn into escargot very quickly.
That is a great question. I have no idea.
Something to contemplate another day. And then we catch sight of the Millennium Falcon.
And Luke quips, "What a piece of junk."
That leads us into the next phase of the hero's journey, the approach of the inmost cave. We've passed the point of no return, and now we're just going further and further. They have to get away from the ships chasing them away from Tatooine, and they do, which demonstrates to us that Han Solo is well deserving of his swagger. And we're like, yay, we're away. And then suddenly we're like, where's Alderaan?
Yeah, it's quite pretty quick because it starts off pretty jovial. Because now, if we had a lot of banter between C-3PO and R2-D2, it's now the banter is between Han and Luke. And Luke is definitely giving like little brother vibes throughout a lot of this movie. I don't know if he feels threatened by Han or he's just jealous of Han because he's kind of what he wanted. He's living this grand adventurous life outside of Tatooine. And as far as I recall, Luke had never left Tatooine before. I guess Star Wars nerds can come at me if I'm wrong about that detail. But when they're escaping Tatooine, and Luke tells Han, he's like, "Why don't you outrun them? I thought you said this ship was fast." And Han's response is, "Watch your mouth, kid, or you're gonna find yourself floating home."
That's an interesting point that you bring up, that Han is almost a character foil to Luke. He's a good reflection for him to work against and foreshadowing for things to come of
Mhm.
my Carrie Fisher talk. I don't wonder if that was a little bit of the dynamic between the actors in real life as well. Not necessarily in like having the life you wanted, but in the interpersonal dynamics, like little
Mhm.
brotherly.
Yeah, because Mark Hamill, who plays Luke Skywalker, was the youngest of the trio by several years, if I'm not mistaken, especially between him and Harrison Ford.
Hmm.
Then, he's critiquing Han Solo, who's, been flying around space for perceivably, most of his adult life. And Han Solo tells him, "This ain't like dusting crops, kid."
Another very interesting line to think about in the context of the movie, because What crops do you have to dust on a moisture farm?
I don't know.
Many
I think,
questions about the
yeah,
moisture farm.
I think maybe Han Solo only knew that he came from a farm and didn't know what type of farm. That'd be my only guess.
Maybe.
There's just so many funny lines in this movie. Like I said, like I could quote so much of this dialogue that I'm a horrible person to experience this movie with for the first time. I have to literally bite my tongue so I don't say the line right before the characters say it. But Luke is training with the remote with the lightsaber, and then Han is kind of commenting, giving his thoughts from the sideline, if you will. He's talking about, oh, it's just a bunch of luck. And Obi-Wan's response is, in my experience, there's no such thing as luck.
That scene is also great setup and foreshadowing for the climax of the movie, the denouement, if you will.
As they're kind of wrapping up this training, because they're coming up on Alderaan, and Han tells Luke, good against remotes is one thing. Good against the living, that's something else entirely.
That also sort of brings up the ethical question of Luke and killing. They never really bring this up ever at any point in the movie, but they kill a lot of people for people who are supposed, like Luke is this wholesome, pure character, and he, jumping ahead, he kills people left, right, and center on the Death Star.
It's not in this movie, but there are several like in canon stories where this issue is dealt with, and so many. I think one in particular, it's a Star Wars novel called Lost Stars by Claudia Gray. It's a great read, by the way. It's mostly from the perspective of the Imperials, though one of the characters later becomes a rebel. But one of some of the biggest driving motivators for these characters who are in the Imperial Academy is when the Death Star is blown up because they knew so many people on it.
One of the good things about this movie is that good and evil are so distinctly separate. However, that is also a flaw, as my mom would say, its biggest strength can also be its biggest weakness, because they never deal with the fact that they do kill a lot of people. They never even think about it. So now you have this good, wonderful character who is killing remorselessly, which actually brings me to a fun fact that I learned in George Lucas, A Life by Brian J. Jones, which some people may know that Luke's original name was Luke Starkiller, and it was that for years. However, with incidents like the Manson murders in mind, he decided to change Luke's name to Luke Skywalker so it was less reminiscent of serial killers. And then look at Luke go. Luke Starkiller after all.
The Death Star was, the size of a moon. And so it literally had, I don't know how many, I would have to look up in canon how many people were on the Death Star, but it's quite a few.
Probably part of the reason that they are all wearing face masks too, because it's less serious if you're killing faceless people. Calls to mind the misattributed Joseph Stalin quote.
Yes.
One death is tragedy, a million is a statistic. Moving right along.
Yeah, too dark. But one of my favorite lines in the movie, hands down, is when they sneak aboard. Well, they don't sneak aboard. They get tractor beamed into that's no moon, Death Star. Obi-Wan says, who's more foolish, the fool or the fool who follows him?
Iconic out of Obi-Wan, as many things in this movie are iconic. And if you take a drink every time I say iconic of water, so you're really hydrated, you still may die of water poisoning. This leads us, Obi-Wan's ominous words, lead us into the next phase of the hero's journey, the ordeal. And the ordeal is one of the most packed phases of A New Hope, and it also introduces us to the crew. We've seen Princess Leia throughout the movie, but this is when the lads meet her.
Yes.
And this leads me to hop up on my soapbox. And what leads me to that is Luke opens the cell to see Princess Leia, and she is posed like she is laying on the cover of Vogue. Like, what is she doing?
Yeah, I have serious questions as well about that.
But my soapbox today is about Carrie Fisher, legend, icon, and diva that she was. As many of you will probably recall, there was this famous quote going around when she unfortunately passed away. I was reminded of it when I was researching through George Lucas, A Life by Brian J. Jones. I was reminded of this, and it would be a tragedy if I didn't read this to you guys.
You have to tell. I had never heard the stories. This was great.
So this is an excerpt of her book, Wishful Drinking. Anyway, George comes up to me the first day of filming, and he takes one look at the dress and says, you can't wear a bra under that dress. So I say, okay, I'll buy it. Why? And he says, because there's no underwear in space. I promise you this is true, and he says it with such conviction, too. Like he had been to space and looked around and he didn't see any bras or panties or briefs anywhere. Now, George came to my show when it was in Berkeley. He came backstage and explained why you can't wear your brassiere in other galaxies. And I have a sense you will be going to outer space very soon. So here's why you cannot wear your brassiere per George. So what happens is you go to space and you become weightless. So far so good, right? But then your body expands, but your bra doesn't. So you get strangled by your own bra. Now I think that this would make a fantastic obit. So I tell my younger friends that no matter how I go, I want it reported that I drowned in moonlight, strangled by my own bra. Drowned in moonlight, strangled by my own bra. It's so iconic.
I'm trying not to laugh too much into the microphone.
This is also similarly reported in George Lucas' A Life by Brian J. Jones. Jones writes, Lucas didn't want her looking too aggressively feminine, using gaffer's tape to hold down her breasts. No breast bounce in space. No jiggling in the Empire, Fisher snickered, adding, Gary Kurtz had to tell me that. George didn't have the nerve. She tells it much funnier in her book. To me, that sounds like a nightmare.
Yes.
No jiggling in the Empire is going to live rent-free in my head as well. That is also iconic. I'm envious of how funny Carrie Fisher was and how incredibly she was able to move that humor into writing. And this would have been a much poorer movie without her. Like I mentioned earlier with the interpersonal dynamic with Mark Hamill. In her book, The Princess Diarist, Carrie Fisher revealed that she had had an affair with Harrison Ford during the filming of Star Wars, and that had been basically unknown for about 40 years. But it was unknown to Mark Hamill while it was happening in front of his eyes. Per The Hollywood Reporter, Hamill says, I was so self-involved at that point, they could have been doing it in front of me and I wouldn't have noticed. I was single and had my own agenda. Sure, this is full of debauchery and whatnot, the Star Wars set filming in the 70s, but again, everything is so iconic. Rest in peace, Carrie Fisher. I one day hope to write as funnily as you did.
We are missing a true comedian.
From the jump, Princess Leia is an iconic character. Again, iconic. Took a sip of water, be hydrated. Die of water poisoning from the word iconic, which would be iconic of you.
But not as iconic as being strangled by your own bra in the moonlight.
We'll put that in your obituary if you die of the water poisoning. Unlike Marion in Indiana Jones, Princess Leia is not a joke character. She's not solely a damsel in distress. She's been captured, but she's captured this one time, and she's captured while being a hero herself. Her character is treated seriously. Her involvement in the rebellion is never a joke. People respect what she has to say. She can hold her own and not just pretend by drinking in a bar and getting kidnapped every 5 minutes like Marion does. She's the one who saves them from the hallway and puts them in the trash compactor, which is the skinny machine. In the terms of my notes, I said, oh, they're in the skinny machine.
It's funny, when you talk to Star Wars fans, there's some who are like the original trilogy purists, as I would call them, and you can't critique the original trilogy at all in their mind. But like, I'm not one of those, and I will admit the duel, and I'm using air quotes here, between Vader and Obi-Wan, you have to admit, is kind of comical.
When I was watching it this time around, I almost couldn't believe my eyes, and I'll admit I did giggle because that's exactly the way my brothers and I would fight with the plastic lightsabers we had at our house. And then we would fight harder with them. They're just fighting so gingerly.
Yeah, and then randomly Obi-Wan spins. Maybe, obviously, when it came out, we didn't have comparisons to other lightsaber duels. This is the first lightsaber duel ever seen in history, you know. But now that we have other lightsaber duels, this one really just is probably the lowest ranked one. Even below some of them in the, dare we say, the sequel trilogy.
Another day. I honestly love it because of its ginger silliness. I love sci-fi space opera nonsense, and the way that they are just like tapping the lightsabers against each other like they're made of dry noodles is amazing. This is a spaghetti sci-fi movie, not a spaghetti western.
Interesting too, the use of score here as well. There's no music playing when the duel starts. No music kicks in until Luke runs in and actually sees the duel, and he sees Obi-Wan become one with the Force.
Another silly element, because for some people, lightsabers give them cuts, and then for some people, they just disappear into the ether.
The laws around, I should say, lightsaber is especially in the early ones, it's kind of hit or miss.
Well, per Brian J. Jones in George Lucas Alive, originally Obi-Wan was not going to die. He was going to be with them for the entire movie. But iconic hero Marsha Lucas suggested that Obi-Wan dies and then remain as a spirit guide through the rest of the movie.
Yeah, she played a really integral part in this film. I think it's a documentary titled How Star Wars Was Saved in the Editing Room, or it's a video essay I came across once, and we actually watched part of it I took an elective in college called Cinematic Arts 101. Great class, super easy A, because we literally just watched movies in class, and of course, we had to watch Star Wars. But we were talking about how she like re-edited the entire film, because otherwise it would have, without her, we would not have Star Wars in the current form.
In the next phase, the reward, they leave the ship having lost Obi-Wan with Princess Leia, and they return to the rebel base. There's an interesting moment where, again, a point where Leia's character is treated with seriousness that pays homage to the adventure serials while still treating her not just as a swooning damsel. She knows that they have a tracking device on them as they leave the ship, obviously,
Mhm.
because she is a girl boss.
Yeah, this was too easy. Well, the guys are like, "Oh, look at us. We escaped the Death Star." And she's like, that was too easy." And of course, Han is immediately defensive, like, that wasn't easy. He says, sometimes I even amaze myself.
Iconic.
Same with some of the lines between Luke and Han as they're kind of, fighting over Leia, like who's gonna get to ask her out type. And Luke is really giving little brother vibes here.
That is just his vibe throughout the movie. And this is why I have always said, even if they weren't siblings, which they are, if I was Leia, there would have been a competition. Luke, never. Harrison Ford is Han Solo, always. Simple. This is a simple decision.
Yeah.
And they have amazing chemistry from the jump. That's probably why they wound up having an affair.
And then they land on the rebel base. It's on the planet called Yavin 4, not on Dantooine. It always made me laugh that they couldn't come up with another random name that didn't sound too close to Tatooine. But anyway, that's
Maybe
neither
they
here
were
nor there.
nearby.
Maybe. But she has this line, like you've already mentioned, that she's treated as a leader in the Rebel Alliance. Like no one questions her position there. And she meets with one of the admirals and she tells him, we have no time for our sorrows. It's
Because
pretty hard.
she is iconic.
Yeah.
And this is where we really get the reward phase, the reward of the reward phase, because Han gets his money for transporting them there, which is the reward he thinks he wants. And Luke kind of gets this adventurous life he's always wanted. He's offered a new home with the rebellion. So his reward is both the fulfillment of his desires and this new sense of home. And now that they have this reward, that moves us into the phase, the road back, which really furthers this feeling of him choosing his new home.
Mhm.
This is where their roads kind of start diverging. It's a road back, but it's kind of also a road closer to the end. So Han almost has a little bit of a character regression by taking his money and leaving.
Yeah, because Han says, what good is your money if you're dead? She's not wrong.
I think it's nice, though, that he tried to take Luke with him because he's kind of seeing how much of an underdog cause the rebels are. And normally he would just look out for himself and Chewie and they would bail. But he does try to get Luke to go with him, which is so little brother vibes.
And then we get to another iconic sequence, the assault on the Death Star. And, we have the famous trench sequence, which growing up, I used to always think the part of the Death Star they were on was where like the equator would be, but that's actually not where the trench run is. It's much farther north, if you will, on the Death Star. And again, this is another sequence that's very cleverly scored, or when there is a score and when there isn't a score. So there's no score from when the Y bombers enter the trench run until Luke, whose call sign is Red 5, enters the trench. So it's no score. But then when he enters the trench, the score picks back up. And beyond the score, throughout this whole movie, I also really like the sound design. In particular, the TIE fighters, because they remind me, I'm assuming this was done on purpose, of the noise they make especially when they're, diving in, sounds very similar to an actual aircraft that was used in World War II by the Germans called a Stuka dive bomber, in which they actually had a wind turbine underneath the propeller area that when the dive bomber went into its dive, it would make this like screeching noise to add another element of terror in their attacks.
It's interesting that they chose to sound design it that way because, as Ridley Scott taught us in Alien, in space, no one can hear you scream. This is also the part in Lego Star Wars, for all my Lego Star Wars heads out there, where you have to shoot those plasma cannons at the electric force field. There's a couple of those parts. Another interesting thing to point out about this section is all the rebels are fighting and they have to send out Empire reinforcements, and Darth Vader gathers up two conveniently located guys to go with him, and he's like, let's go. But in my notes, I wrote, Darth Vader gathers his baddies to ride. And I did not mean baddies in the bad guy sense. When they're out there fighting, it feels like all hope is lost. Death is upon us. A random guy from Luke's hometown, who is now a rebel pilot, many questions about how that happened, is killed. So someone Luke knows is killed, and he's up there, and all hope is lost. Death is upon us. But that takes us into our next phase of the hero's journey, the resurrection.
I really appreciate through this whole sequence too, like the stakes are real. Like people are dying. Like it gets to the point where basically Luke is the only fully operational X-Wing in this attack. All the other ones are either been shot down or like one of the other pilots had issues with his aircraft, so he had to pull away.
Darth Vader in his little ships comes up and they're about to shoot Luke, and Luke is like just focusing on making the shot because he has, if it means he gets shot down, at least he'll have saved the rebel base and the entire planet. However, it's at this moment our boy comes back on track with his own hero's journey. Han Solo appears and starts shooting.
Yes. We can't ignore it too when he puts his computer away because, Force Ghost. Obi-Wan says, use the Force, Luke. And then as Vader's trying to target him, he's like, the Force is strong with this one. And of course, those have been quoted endlessly since this movie.
That's an interesting setup for later movies, which I don't think George Lucas had in mind, but is sort of serendipitous. Luke, this is his diverging woods path. Either the mentor of Obi-Wan telling him to use the Force, or Darth Vader noticing how strong his power in the Force is as another potential mentor for him later. Light versus dark.
Yeah, and choices. There's lots of choices in this movie.
In this instance, Luke chooses to trust Obi-Wan's Force Ghost. He turns off the computer and makes the shot using the Force alone, giving us a true resurrection moment.
Yes.
And that leads us into our final phase of Luke's hero's journey for A New Hope, return with the elixir. His triumphant moment, in this case the elixir being the rebel base saved and the Death Star destroyed.
And we have the medal ceremony on Yavin 4. This is my hashtag justice for Chewie, because why didn't Chewie get a medal? Is this another example of sci-fi racism?
This is such a beautiful scene, and in my notes, I also wrote that I would wear Luke's outfit in a heartbeat. That's like my favorite color, yellow. You guys can't see it, but I'm literally wearing a cardigan of that same color right at this moment. So fit check on everyone is slay. And I think you might actually have some costuming insight.
Yeah, surprisingly I do. So the necklace that Princess Leia is wearing, I've actually seen it in person, because it's currently housed in the National Museum of Finland in Helsinki, because it's a Finnish jewelry brand known as Kalevala. So randomly when I was in the museum, they had this Star Wars section because there is the necklace that she wore.
This is such a beautiful and triumphant final scene. And of course, since you got the costuming moment, I'll say it. The score is so beautiful. All of it is just incredible. It's visually and sonically amazing. It's visually and sonically iconic.
I love the Throne Room March music. It will feature in my wedding.
And that leads us not into another phase of the hero's journey, which has come to an end, but to the conclusion of our podcast, which also must come to an end soon.
Yes, because I don't know I could talk about Star Wars for hours and never run out of things to say, but alas, this episode must reach its conclusion. And that kind of brings us back to how we started with, as mentioned in the book, The World According to Star Wars. This series proclaims you are free to choose. That's the deepest lesson of Star Wars. That's the twist on the hero's journey. The emphasis on freedom of choice, even when things seem darkest and life is most constrained, is the saga's most inspiring feature.
That's definitely a take. I don't know that I would necessarily agree that that is the deepest lesson of Star Wars.
Yeah, I think it It's definitely a lesson. I don't know if I fully agree either, because I think, especially if you consider the other movies, the prequels, I think this gets really muddled with the idea of, the prophecy of like the chosen one. And so I think it definitely doesn't work as well when you consider the franchise as a whole. But I do think there is something to it that this choice between light and dark is a really interesting conundrum. Like we all have to choose, who or what we're going to be in life.
It's also, there's like an interesting element. How much can we relate the Force in the hero's journey to a more classical hero's journey element of fate, like in
Yes.
ancient Greek hero's
Mhm.
journeys? Odysseus again.
Yeah, I definitely think that's interesting because a lot of people disagree with him with this idea of fate. Yeah, the author even acknowledges, Sunstein acknowledges that this is a kind of a, not sort of is a hot take, if you will, on Star Wars, because this idea of fate and the Force. Yeah, so it's definitely an interesting view, at least.
That's a debate that goes on in many arenas of life, and we do not have the time today to debate in its full spectrum, free will versus predestination. And we
Yes.
never will have time. That debate rages
Mm-mm.
on, and who knows if people choose to do that or if they're predestined to. But we cannot be having that here about Star Wars today.
Yes. And I think some of the other things that we've kind of already touched on is Star Wars has a lot to say too about republics, empires, rebellions, and in particular, upon rewatching Star Wars, this line that Princess Leia tells to Grand Moff Tarkin, the leader of the Death Star, though she ironically kind of has a British accent during this sequence. Maybe it's just because she's interacting with Peter Cushing. But she says, "The more you tighten your grip, Tarkin, the more star systems will slip through your fingers." I think that's such an interesting dilemma. Like, how do you maintain control without inciting rebellion? And how easy do republics and empires fall? I just found it a really interesting commentary on real life.
It is really interesting too, because if I'm not mistaken, there's still a Senate. Is Leia
Yes.
not a senator? So
Hmm.
it's very Rome becoming an empire instead
Yes.
of a republic, because when Rome became an empire, they kept some structures of the republic almost just for show.
Rome isn't the only example. Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because it's a flyby moment of dialogue that you really don't necessarily pay attention to. But Napoleon also did the same thing. He kept the facade up of a republic, but all the power was centered in him. And so we have real historical events to that echo, or let's just say this movie echoes real life history.
Another thing that helps ground you in the story, even though it's a story you may not be familiar with, even if you are familiar with its structural elements and influences.
Exactly. Though we do have some further readings to recommend. And of course, if you somehow haven't seen this movie, please go see it. Your world will be changed. But like I said, I've already mentioned this book a couple times, The World According to Star Wars by Cass R. Sunstein. It's a great read. And then on Disney Plus, there's a documentary series called Light and Magic, which is about ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, who did the special effects on a whole myriad of movies, and season two just dropped.
And if I'm not mistaken, based on what you and friend of the show, Leah, have told me, there is one Star Wars property on Disney Plus coming out that does still give us a glimmer of hope for the franchise.
By far, my favorite Disney Plus series is Andor. Season one was amazing. I highly recommend it. It deals with this idea of republics and empires in a very cool, very subtle, but such like it's great writing. I love the series, and with season two, I'm hopeful.
Now, for my further readings, of course, you must go read with your eyes or audiobook with your ears George Lucas, A Life by Brian J. Jones. This is the second episode I have recommended that you do that. So why are you waiting? Go do that.
It's in
Another
my Amazon cart.
when it's almost summertime, if you don't have classes this summer, or if you're laying on the beach, maybe crack the spine on that one. Now, many of my recommendations this time are on YouTube. One, go look at the comparison between the screams that Obi-Wan does for the sand creatures. Okay, you'll get a good laugh out of it. It's not very long. I think maybe even a minute or less. On YouTube also, I beg everyone to go watch this video. It's actually amazing. How Not to Steal Star Wars, Rebel Moon. by the closer look. I have referenced that video extensively, and when I was watching the movie, it popped into my mind and I thought about it a lot. And then I made Stephanie watch it. As we mentioned in Little Women, I love to inflict YouTube videos upon her.
Yes, I usually have quite a catalog waiting for me to watch there at some point.
Then, if you're interested in further information on the hero's journey, there's a really good succinct video called 12 Stages of the Hero's Journey, Christopher Vogler by Film Courage on YouTube. And there's a lot of information on the hero's journey out there. Some of it boring, but this one I felt was interesting to listen to and not too long. Two of the best things that you can
Yes,
have in research that is for fun. And I will link all of the YouTube videos I mentioned in the description. And then finally, please go read some of Carrie Fisher's hilarious writings and interviews. Even if you don't agree with her lifestyle, who cares? She's so funny, and listening to someone honestly look at their life and share it is very vulnerable, and she does it in a way that is, dare I say, iconic.
take another drink of water.
And if you made it this far, you will be excited to know our next episode will be a refreshing kickoff into summer.
We'll be just moving forward in time about 3 years to the year of 1980 for the release of ABBA's Super Troopers.
Mamma mia!